This meeting is being recorded.
Ooh.
See you all. Good to see you all.
Hi, Michael.
Yes.
Good afternoon, Michael.
Hi, Rob.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Rolf.
Hi, Michael.
Great. Nigel, how are you doing?
Surely he's not on mute.
No, it's sausage fingers. Can't find the right button on the side. So yeah, I'll get the training done in a couple of years' time. But I'm well, thank you. And all is good in my funny world.
That's good.
See, people are still coming in, so we're down to 71 participants. 72 is still going up at the moment. So we give it another minute. People are dropping in.
1 more minute seems reasonable, I think.
Yeah.
And then I'll catch on otherwise.
Rob, with your elephant in the room, I don't think there's space for any maneuvering around.
There's nothing, is there? No, we need to let him out, which is what I'll do straight away.
He's such an overfed elephant.
Yes, and he's vaguely greenwashed, which was the point, really. He's sort of that's part of the thing.
Brilliant. So it's 2 minutes past. We can see 88, 89 participants now. I think it's time to start. Thank you all for joining this webinar, organized by the Groundwater Modelers Forum of the Geological Society. I have the pleasure of introducing to you our presenter, Rob Soley from WSP. After working in Nepal and Malawi for 5 years, Rob has just passed 30 years as a UK consultant with a company now owned by WSP. He helped the Environment Agency design CAMS ledgers, EFIs, and the Water Resources GIS tool, as well as steering the build and use of 15 regional groundwater and river flow models. He greatly enjoys working with clients, stakeholders, and colleagues. So the title of Rob's presentation today is Modeling Around the Elephant in the Room. I think it's very obvious from the first slide. So Rob, over to you. You have about 45 minutes, and then we have about 15 minutes for questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilias. Hello, everybody. So I seem to start all my talks these days with an apology. And before my company sort of sacks me for the stuff I'm about to say, I have to sort of largely disown myself from them and say that I'm clearly standing on my own soapbox here in all that I'm saying. So you can blame me for all of that. So the stuff that I'm going to go through in the 45 minutes or so, I'm going to let the elephant out first and just get straight to the punchlines, really, rather than waiting to the end. I'm going to try and describe a bit of a potted history of how sort of river flow targets were developed, how they've been progressively moving upstream, and also tightening as they've gone, and some of the tools that have been used to sort of model what the consequences of that might be, groundwater modeling and other tools. There's a few examples of some of the projects I've worked on more recently, looking at the sort of size of groundwater and surface water abstraction reductions that are on the table at the moment being considered. There's a bit of a future look because I think it's sobering and important to look forward to see what's going to happen to low flows in the future from the current climate projections that we're getting. And at the end, there'll be a sort of few things that I think we should be doing so that we're in a good place to sort of to go forward into that future, really. You can blame Heather Streetley, by the way, for these little elephants that keep popping up. She suggested I did this through the whole presentation, but I sort of ran out of energy after the first few slides. But anyway, there they are. So these are my sort of things that I think I'm trying to say. I'm starting here from a state of some personal guilt, I think, having been partly responsible for dreaming up some of these river flow standards. They now seem to be being pursued I would suggest almost regardless of ecological benefit or cost. And we are on the cusp of planning to give up access to a huge amount of groundwater storage at a time when I think we need it more than ever. I think we've created a bit of an altar of naturalness, and in so doing, we've kind of made smarter management a bit of a dirty word. And particularly at the moment, I think we're just aiming very broadly. The brush is very big and broad and unaffordable, really, for cuts almost everywhere. So in the early noughties, the Environment Agency rightly recognised the need to have some sort of consistent abstraction pressure screening process, starting from a natural flow duration curve from which you could hang some sort of environmental flow screening thresholds and compare that with what was actually going on to define how much water there might be for abstraction. And in places where you were below those thresholds, there was a part of the process called a sustainability assessment. And that included consideration of, yes, the environment, but also people and carbon and money. And I think we've gone from there over the last 20 years to a situation now where the definition of the word sustainable has almost been morphed to say, you've just got to meet the river flow target. In some places, those river flow targets are also being tightened, even though they were precautionary to start with. And there's an expectation really after some degree of impatience that they just need to be met now. Now, I think the risk is we're setting ourselves up for a future where a lot of the groundwater abstraction reductions may not deliver the low flow benefits that are perhaps anticipated, or the associated ecological sort of biodiversity benefits as well. So I think that might be disappointing to people. I think the process of sort of massive national replumbing that we're entering will be extremely expensive, and somebody's got to pay for it. And, you know, at the moment we're in a cost of living crisis. And I think as we're thinking about all of these things, the climate is shifting, and I think low flows can be expected to fall. So we need to be doing something about making our habitats more resilient in that truth, I think. So I can sort of understand how having drawn maps like this that I think do reasonably show where the abstraction pressures are greatest, people are now sort of saying, well, you know, we want to turn that map green everywhere. In some places, we want to tighten the flow standards, and the consequences through some of the tools that I'll show you in a minute. We've worked out roughly how much reduction in abstraction would be taken, particularly from groundwater abstraction to needed to get there. It's a lot of water that we'd be losing, water that's already resilient to drought and climate change relatively. And we're moving from a system of sort of local water for local people in terms of groundwater storage under our feet. And we have to replace all of that before we even start to get more resilient for the future. So we have to build lots of more pump transfers, desalination, effluent recycling, all expensive operationally and to build, and more surface water reservoirs just to stand still before we can sort of get more resilient for the future. So that's really the punchlines. Before I go on to the detail, that I think we've abused the word sustainability somewhat. I think that the mantra of sort of we can only get to natural flows by switching off groundwater abstractions is leading us to abandoning storage or under our feet on a huge scale, and we need that. I think there are things that we should be doing to sort of more effectively prioritize abstraction cuts locally and actually do things on the ground to create more resilient habitats and to deliver benefits more quickly, cheaply, and with better outcomes. But I think it's just hard to get to that level of prioritization when the brush is so broad. And from a kind of purely sort of personal and sort of professional point of view, if this comes to pass and there is, you know, largely wiping out our use of the chalk, particularly as an aquifer, then what will there be left for hydrogeologists to do, I would say. Okay, so the next bit is a sort of bit of a summary of how we've got into this pickle, I think. The first model I was involved in back in the 90s was a model of Redgrave and Lopham Fens. And at that stage, the Environment Agency and Essex and Suffolk Water and Suffolk Wildlife Trust all got together, recognising that this fen was being adversely impacted by a large local groundwater abstraction. And the Environment Agency worked on restoring the surface drainage and the water level management. The water company, with a bit of help from us on the modelling, relocated the abstraction locally, but still maintained their supplies. And the Wildlife Trust worked on the management of the site and vegetation control and everything else. And it's a great thing, and it won awards, and it sort of delivered benefit but maintained local supplies. So that was the kind of that's what I kind of like to get back to, I guess, is that sort of example of the way of just getting on and doing stuff that makes a difference and creates some resilient habitat. However, the agency at the same time roughly recognised that there was a need for a nationally consistent abstraction pressure screening process. So CAMS ledgers and the CAMS process was invented. Each of these black polygons has a CAMS ledger spreadsheet in it. And the scale of these CAMS assessment point catchments, of which there's about 1,200 across the country, you can see on the coloured polygons in the map. And that's where at each of those points you have this assessment of flows, recent actual, fully licensed against the green lines, the thresholds for environmental flow screening. And then you did this sustainability appraisal process. When the Water Framework Directive came along, there was a significant moving upstream of those assessment points. So we went from about 1,200 assessment points to about 9,500 water bodies, many more headwater catchments involved. And the tool for doing that shifted from CAMS ledgers, which then became linked to the Water Resources GIS in an iterative sort of update type way, so that you could get some answers to send to Brussels for all of those river, lake, and transitional water bodies. Same sort of process, but doing the calculations at a few snapshot percentiles and able to produce maps like this, which then sort of fed into prioritizing WINEP investigations by water companies into areas where abstraction pressures seem to be more than was desirable. So that's all kind of fine. Within the guts of the Water Resources GIS, there is a good database of where all of the groundwater abstractions, surface water abstractions, discharges, and more complicated things like reservoirs, transfers, groundwater support schemes, complicated hands-off flow conditions and things. And all of that is stirred up in the context of the natural flows. And on the groundwater side in particular, there's some degree of flexibility in how that's represented in the Water Resources GIS. So in the GWABS table, impacts can be spread about spatially across up to 5 water bodies. And they can also be varied, if you like, from the low flow end to the high flow end of the flow duration curve. So there's this thing called a lowest flow impact factor, which can be varied to reflect your understanding of what might actually be going on. So you can have less impact at low flows than you do at high flows, for example, which often seems to be the way things work, as I'll sort of describe in some examples coming up. Now, once you've got those things into a tool like the Water Resources GIS, what's happened recently is that the Environment Agency's just done the national framework stuff, which has been used to inform this round of water resource management planning. And the numbers that have been thrown out by the Environment Agency for the sort of abstraction reductions required have come from the Water Resources GIS using a tool called FIXIT. And FIXIT effectively looks at the extent to which flows are below where you would like them to be. And it calculates the reductions in abstraction that you'd need to get to your targets. It does that, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but it does that working iteratively down the catchment, starting in the headwaters, looking at all of the groundwater abstraction impacts on this particular water body, deciding what the reductions to them are required, making those reductions, and then moving on to the next water body, revisiting the first ones if necessary. And as you move down the catchment, taking account of the sort of benefits from upstream that reductions upstream have made. And in that way, you end up with maps like this, which sort of show for a particular set of assumptions what the target flows are, and which abstractions you're allowed to reduce, etc. You get maps of how much you'd need to reduce things by individually. And this has been the basis of what's been sent to water companies. This example is actually from when we were developing the code, so it's not the actual numbers from the national framework, But this is where these sort of conclusions that, for example, in comparison with recent actual groundwater abstraction across the whole country, you'd probably have to lose over 2,700 megalitres a day to get to this. There remain some residual sort of poorer colours on the map, which are to do largely with surface water abstraction impacts on river flows, etc. And if you do the same calculations for fully licensed, you find, you know, almost double that sort of rate of reduction would be needed. So that's where those national framework numbers came from. What's happened in the last couple of years, really, with the chalk stream strategy is that upward migration of assessment points has continued. And there is now sort of quite seriously on the table the notion that there is a need to protect chalk springs and chalk sort of points of perenniality kind of where they are. Natural England has also introduced something called their B6 indicator, which again is aimed at screening headwater areas of chalk catchments in particular to consider groundwater abstraction pressures sort of even further upstream than the WFD water body outflow points. So protecting effectively perennial spring heads where the QN99, you know, is really close to zero. And as you can imagine, you apply the sort of standard percentage of natural low flow measures, and 5% of roughly no flow is roughly no abstraction. So I'm giving this one the elephant basically and saying, you know, the conclusion of this is that, you know, nobody moves. This is not an aquifer for people anymore, if you follow this sort of logic. Now, whilst that upward assessment point migration has been going on, what's also happened is that the approach towards environmental flow regulation has also tightened and hardened. So we've gone from a position where we had these screening thresholds, which were kind of called that, and a sustainability appraisal process that considered things more broadly, to one in which sustainable just means meet the flow standard. There is a notion that it's possible to have alternative local flow standards, but in the context of any particular local location, it's usually the standard of evidence required to sort of make that stick is usually impossible to meet because the data often isn't there, and it's impossible to prove anything to move away from the precautionary sort of standard that's been established nationally. So very few examples of where anything like that has happened. What's happened with the national framework stuff is that those original defaults, which were precautionary, have been tightened further in some regards. So, for example, there's a notion that all chalk streams should be abstraction sensitivity band 3. All salmon streams, again, should be abstraction sensitivity band 3. And there hasn't been a lot of kind of clear evidence presented as to what the benefits of that will be. It's just the notion that these things are, you know, our crown jewels to protect, and therefore they should have the highest standards, without really considering whether or not those standards are effectively what the ecology needs. And on the far right of this, I've put the sort of approaches currently being applied to SSI rivers. So Natural England has the Common Standards Monitoring Guidelines standards, which are very much like the environmental flow indicator, but they have to be applied on a daily basis. So they're not flow duration curve based, they are flow on the day based. And they have a legal weight, and they have been defined as part of the favourable conditions criteria for these river systems. So, you know, they have to be met even if there's actually no sort of demonstrable ecological benefit in meeting them. They still have to be met in order to tick that box. And all of that is true at the moment, kind of however bonkers the cost. So I'm giving this one another elephant. And at the stage we're at the moment in the water resource management planning cycle, all the water companies, as far as I can see, have said, okay, fair enough, this is what you're telling us. We will put in plans to try and do what you want. And that's going to go around the hoop until it gets to Ofwat. And I'm assuming at some point Ofwat may well tell us that we can't afford it. So that's, I think, where we're at the moment. And again, it's a plea to kind of get back to some sort of more holistic, less siloed approach, where you consider things more in the round, look at where you can actually deliver local biodiversity benefits more quickly and affordably, and try and do that without trashing effectively our resilient groundwater supplies on a massive scale. So more priority and focus. And I think to a certain extent, we have to do that with some understanding as to how much money nationally we actually want to spend on this problem, and then work out where we can deliver the most benefit for that. Difficult, but I think we should try. Before we move off the sort of general regulatory stuff, it's also worth not forgetting wetlands. So again, beyond river flows, the Environment Agency, Natural England, and indeed a judicial review in East Anglia has recently concluded that wetlands require, a very high standard of protection. Again, we're putting them on a bit of a natural altar within 5% of natural flows. That's how much sort of deviation we're allowed. And the consequences of this in East Anglia, sort of beyond the water company abstraction reductions, is that many farmers who currently sort of rely on groundwater for irrigation won't be able to use it anymore. So that's another part of the jigsaw. Now, in parallel with that whole story over the last 20 years, there has been the focus of this kind of groundwater modelers forum. There has been the development of these regional groundwater and river flow models. And all of the black bordered ones all have a kind of whole flow simulation, as I call it, dealing with all the runoff and the recharge and base flow together, so that you can, so for a particular patch, for example, in East Anglia, you can use these models to look at locally for each stream cell and for the river water body outflow points and for the wetlands, what is the compliance with these standards at all of those locations and at all of those scales. So that's clearly an important tool to use to inform the assessments. Back in 2012, when we were all together last in Birmingham, well, I was there anyway in Birmingham, did this paper on groundwater abstraction impacts. Basically, lots of examples of how the modelling and the experience of switching abstractions off shows that it's very often disappointing, the amount of low flow recovery you get back for the abstraction that you've switched off. So one of the examples here, you can see my clicker there, just looking at the location in a star of a source. This is near Chichester. It's a source which is right next to a river, the River Wallington, and a bit further away from the River Meon and the Haventon Bedhampton Springs down here. Now, those outflow points from the aquifer are at different elevations. So the River Wallington is next door, but it's relatively high elevation compared to the River Meon, which gets base flow most of the year round where it flows off the chalk. And that's higher again than the Haventon Bedhampton Springs, which are sort of underneath the syncline, loads of water pours out of them here. So, you look at the predicted impacts of that abstraction on the water environment, and you find this interesting pattern where, most of the impacts of that abstraction are indeed on the Wallington, but not at low flows. Under low flow conditions, there's much less impact on the Wallington, and under high flow conditions, when the whole aquifer is overflowing locally, there's much more impact. The impacts across the Meon are much more sort of constant across the year. And the impacts on the springs actually are a bit more when flows are low than they are when flows are high. And this is all because of the different elevations of the drainage points from the aquifer. And that's the sort of thing that these models are really good at predicting. And for all sorts of other reasons to do with, the nonlinear behavior of the aquifer, the difference in the way it responds when it's full and empty, stream elevations, as I've described, the variations in permeability with depth, which is particularly an issue in chalk, winterborne sort of path lengths changing as the aquifer fills up and the stream heads, the spring heads suddenly come closer to your borehole. All of those things matter, as does the layering of the aquifer, where it's confined storage and other things in that paper. Actually, subsequently, what I've realized is there's a thing missing in that paper that is another reason why groundwater abstraction impacts on low flows tend to be less. And that's groundwater evaporation, basically, from droughts. In drought periods, quite a lot of the water you may get when the water table recovers may in fact evaporate rather than contributing to flow downstream. So it's kind of important that we use these models that have been developed to try and wise up some of the other Environment Agency tools like the CAMS ledgers and the Water Resources GIS, because if you don't do that, then you end up with decisions about WINEP priorities and everything being based on a calculation platform that hasn't got the benefit of these models that you've got. So again, in 2013, there was a whole suite of work sort of developed for Mark Whiteman for anybody to use, which is called the sort of process of model alignment. And lots of tools, flow maps, the artificial influences upstream, daily flows, all of that stuff was developed then and rolled out. And I had a look recently at those impact factors within the water resources GIS, just to see where across the country people have actually been, doing that, wising up the water resources GIS, and it's very patchy, so it's quite clear that there's some areas where this hasn't really happened at all. And I think that's partly because it hasn't been put into the scope of modeling projects, or because maybe people didn't know about it, but I'm just flagging it up again. I think it's an important thing to do. Recently, another tool called the batched abstraction modeling process has been developed, whereby you can actually amidst a fully licensed or recent actual scenario that has the combined impacts of everything in it, you can get the individual contributions of all individual abstractions into lines that you could just copy straight into a CAMS ledger. So you can directly plug in, if you like, the outputs from the model's understanding of abstraction impacts for all abstractions into the CAMS ledger, and that will go up into the water resources GIS and inform things. So just, another flag, do use it. They're all Environment Agency tools. They're there for you to use. An example of how we sort of dutifully did what we were told and started looking at what the implications of this point X sort of point of perenniality regulation might be. So we looked at a range of abstraction scenarios. We used the fix-it tool to say in this model, how much abstraction reduction might you need to get to meet the environmental flow indicator, or to meet a slightly more stringent environmental flow indicator, and how much more abstraction reduction might you need to actually meet the flow targets set for even all of the points of perenniality, this kind of EFI plus X stuff, or ASB3 plus X stuff. And what we found, this is for the CAM Bedford ooze model as a whole, is that compared to across that model 144 megalitres a day of sort of recent actual abstraction, if you want to meet all of the flow targets at the outflow points to all the water bodies, you've got to reduce that to about 60. Actually, most of them are already close to ASB3, so that didn't make much difference. But then if you want to make more difference and actually meet all of the sort of points of perenniality, the springs, you have to virtually switch everything off, as you would probably guess. Little illustration of that from this particular catchment. So this is from a starting position where you have around about, within this catchment, about 14 megalitres a day of groundwater abstraction. And that is indeed causing some non-compliance at the outflow point of the water body, 7 megalitres a day deficit. The overall model abstraction is 144. And if you go from there to plugging in the numbers that are suggested for meeting the outflow point compliance, it does indeed deliver that. So if you like, there's some confirmation there that in places where you've used the groundwater model to wise up the water resources GIS, then when you use a tool like Fixes on the water resources GIS, it does produce some sort of results that are kind of probably quite credible. So if the water resources GIS is producing dumb answers for things, it may be because you haven't told it the better understanding from the modeling. So that's largely fixed the outflow problem, but it's left you with some non-compliant reaches further up. If you actually went to meet the ASB3 stuff, then that makes a bit of a difference again, and you fix more of the problem, and you've got now a small surplus at the outflow point of the water body. If you go further and you just do a simple, well, I'm going to switch off everything within 4 kilometers of those non-compliant points, then effectively you can reach a point where the whole map's gone green, but you have wiped out all of the groundwater abstraction completely. Now, as an interesting little, so there's the chalk stream first mantra, if you like, is that this is where you want to end up, with no abstraction from the catchment, but you have a certain amount of surplus at the bottom. And actually, if you track the numbers through, I said we started with 14 megalitres a day abstraction when we started, and there was a deficit of -7. And by the end, we've got to no abstraction, and we've got a surplus of +5. So -7 + 5 is +12. +12 compared to 14 is not far away. So in this case, it's a sort of example of how that idea of chalk stream first, if you replumbed the whole thing so that you were just taking water out of the river further downstream, you would have lost about 2 megalitres a day, but not too severely. And that's because most of the abstractions in this particular catchment are pretty close to the perennial spring heads of these streams. So there's very little groundwater storage involved in the abstraction process. One last sort of tool to flag up that's happened this year, really, to try and get further with getting more value out of these models to inform the way things are done in terms of regulation. All of the flows from all of the models with a whole flow simulation have been uploaded into a national model database and GIS, which Mark Whiteman and Mike Dunbar have sort of sponsored in the Environment Agency. And the point of this is to try and start moving away, hopefully, from default precautionary environmental flow indicator type approaches to pull together this wealth of modeling information with the absolute wealth of macroinvertebrate data that the Environment Agency has nationally and has collected for many years. So there's a lot of historical monitoring that's been done with that Environment Agency macroinvert data, and you can put those things together as part of a pooled modeling process to try and understand the sort of levels of abstraction impact that you need to actually make a material difference to the bugs and the beasties in the rivers. This is all based on stress periods at the moment, but it's possible in future that we could move this towards a sort of daily synthesized data as well, which would give better correlations with the sort of life observed expected analysis, which is based on macroinvert data, which is measured on a particular day. So I think, again, it's another thing that should be added to the sort of the way in which we do our modeling project. Should have always at the end something saying, and now you finished the model and it's fine, then upload it to this and update this so that it can be used as part of a bigger pooled assessment of river flow objectives. And this work by APEM and Stantec on behalf of Severn Trent sort of predates all of that, but effectively represents something similar, whereby they've looked at all this macroinvertebrate data. Each one of these points is a sampling point. And they've assessed its sort of health according to sort of standard indices. So you go from sort of good, which is green, to high, and down to moderate and poor. And they've considered that across the whole of the West Midlands against all of the different degrees of difference from natural flow that are represented in all of the samples. So they've looked at Q75 and the proportion of Q75 that's sort of lost through abstraction. And their conclusions, which are sort of summarized in here, is, I've just put it in red at the bottom in simpler words, that if you look at the default environmental flow indicator that says, you know, you're allowed to have between 15 and 24% of Q70, compared to that, the evidence from the macroinvert data is that for 90% of sites that have impacts up to 50% of Q70 are still at good status or better. So there's a strong argument, if you like, to be less precautionary. And if we're looking for ways to prioritize things based on what the actual ecological benefits may be, then I think we need to move away from the sort of precautionary starting points and try and do more of this work to work out what actually matters to the ecology in the rivers. So some examples of sort of groundwater and surface water abstraction reductions that are on the table at the moment for consideration. And what I've done here is I've actually borrowed some stuff from John Lawson, who's been doing work on behalf of the Chalk Stream First project. He's done a number of simple modeling approaches. This is something he's done just looking at abstraction as a percentage of recharge in a whole number of chalk catchments across the south and east of the country. So there's a gradient here of abstraction pressures, being highest at the top and lowest at the bottom. I thought it was helpful for me to put the examples that I'm picking, if you like, on that scale so that you can see where I'm at and the stuff that I have not put in. Actually, this analysis that he's got is very similar to within the water resources GIS. There's something called equivalent recharge circles, which just gives you a sort of a visual mapped indicator of abstraction pressure, and the sort of test that the Environment Agency does with water body, groundwater body balance tests, etc. So my examples that I've got I'm actually starting out not in a place that John does much on, but in a place of severe groundwater abstraction historical, which is the Mersey. I've then got something from John himself from one of his much simpler models for the Ver, which is up here. And then my two main examples that I've worked on mostly in the last 2 or 3 years are the Itchen and the Avon down here, and the Test indeed. And the point is here that these are really quite a long way down the list of sort of pressures. Now they happen to be Habitats Directive sort of designated rivers. So they've been given that extra weighting of importance, but they're not the same degree of pressure that you've got in the Cray or the Lee or the Darrant. These sort of rivers that tend to be particularly around London, where some of the undoubtedly the largest pressures on the chalk streams are. So starting with the Mersey. So I picked this one because, again, I think there's a big misunderstanding about the word sustainable. And I wanted to start with a place where there is evidence of genuinely unsustainable groundwater abstraction history. So these are actually plots of calibrations of a model that ESI did back in the day of the Mersey Basin, showing basically in response, this sort of graph starts in 1860, and then I've chopped out all the middle bit and started in 1960. So huge buildup in abstraction over 100 years, sort of peaking around about 1970 and then falling off quite substantially as industry closed down and as other sources of water, particularly the reservoirs and things in Wales, came on tap. So as a result of that really high peak rate of abstraction, groundwater levels were plummeting. We were effectively looking at groundwater mining. And that ended sort of in tears in a period of saline intrusion around the Mersey Basin. Genuinely not enough water to support those abstractions. And it's only with the reduction in abstraction that effectively there has been recovery of groundwater levels. And there are now, as far as I understand it, in that patch, some areas where groundwater levels are now close to the surface again. There may even be some groundwater flooding risks. And I just wanted to make the point, looking at this example, that actually I don't know of anywhere that we have at the moment in England where we are unsustainably mining groundwater now. So, I think often people, when they hear the word unsustainable, they think this is going on, but it isn't. We don't, I think, have any areas like this anymore. Somebody will correct me doubtless in the questions. So, I mean, in this particular patch, the sort of hot question at the moment is between that peak abstraction rate, which reflects where some licenses still are and where abstractions are now. Is there some wriggle room left? Could we increase abstraction a little bit? Because frankly, we're going to need it in order to create this massive joined up national system, because this is one of the areas where during dry periods, instead of the water from the reservoirs in North Wales going to supply the Northwest, there's a notion that it will supply the Northwest transfer that will go into the Severn and then into the Thames and then down to some of the other example areas that I'm talking about. So during those periods, there won't be water from the Welsh reservoirs. So there's a notion that some of these abstractions may have to, again, increase a little bit, and how far can they go without having these problems of the past. My next example, I just wanted to throw it in because it's an example of a different sort of model. So John has produced models for several chalk headwater catchments called CSF models, chalk stream first models. They're effectively very simple lump models. In the hydrogeological tent of things, the poor chap gets lampooned as being, this is far too simple. It doesn't include all of the right things that need to be included. It doesn't include the processes, etc. But they fit really well, and it's interesting to note as well that even just having a simple lump parameter model that is essentially non-linear representation of the head driving flow into a chalk stream, you can take out abstraction from that and you still find this notion that under low flow conditions, you get a lot less flow recovery than you would under high flow conditions. So even, with a much simpler model, that seems to be the case. In this case, he's got an example of where his model's prediction of what happened after a particular abstraction was switched off is not a million miles away from the kind of gauge flow response. So, an example of a different sort of modeling tool, which is a lot cheaper and quicker, but probably doesn't have the proper understanding of the locations of individual abstractions and how that affects how they are going to impact river flows, which is why we probably can't rely on it for making some of these big decisions. This is an example. I previously flagged this on a recent talk, but from the headwaters of the River Itchen, whereby in particular, if we just focus on this, the existence of this source here, which I've called source A, there's another source here as well. The question is, where does the impact of that source happen? It's going at about 11 megalitres a day. And when does it happen? So how is that profiled through time? And we've got the different receptor rivers around here. So it itself is somewhere away from perennial spring heads, got the Wey, the Candover, the Arl, and the Diva. And what we find basically across the flow duration curve, that, in response to that very steady rate of groundwater abstraction of 11 megalitres a day, you get this pattern of extremely seasonally variable, low flows, much lower rates, impacts across these different receptors. The biggest impacts probably overall on the Wey, but almost nothing at low flows, up to much higher rates at high flows, and similar patterns for the Candover, a bit more steady on these other ones. You add them all up, and you find again that if you were to switch this source off, as is indeed suggested, as we'll see in a minute, then you get 3 megalitres a day back at low flows overall and 18 at high flows. So you might not notice it that much, to be honest. The reason for that is because, when you look at drawdown, this is a source that develops drawdown in the summer. And that's a good thing. That's not mining. So that's not the example I showed you previously from the Mersey. This is something that just happens every summer. It's taking some water from storage instead of directly from river flows. And that's how it works. And that's a good thing, because you couldn't build a surface reservoir there to replace it, because it would leak like a sieve. And you don't have to, because there's one under the ground already. It's called an aquifer. Now, there's other things in this local patch which are also about to be trashed. So the Candover augmentation scheme, similarly well located for this sort of groundwater storage development, that has historically supported up to 22 megalitres a day of water that's been pumped for sort of downstream re-abstraction. It's also quite capable of actually, alongside that, supplying on a more frequent basis enough flow to just keep these flows in the Candover stream and the Itchen actually close to natural. So the sort of aim of having flows close to natural could be fulfilled without actually having to switch off any of these abstractions. But there is a mantra, so overall, this little patch of grounds, sort of add that lot together, it's supplying 40 megalitres a day. There's a mantra now that sort of, we put this naturalness on a pedestal, and we have to keep flows close to natural, and we have to do that only by switching abstractions off. We can't support anything. That's the sort of way these common standard monitoring guidelines work. So as a result of that, we scrub all of that lot, and we have to find that water from somewhere else. And looking further downstream, which I'll do in the next slide, there's even more abstraction reduction. So towards the bottom of the Itchen, and indeed the bottom of the test, you've got abstractions both from the ground and the river which don't have the same kind of groundwater storage development value. They're all represented as relatively instant impact on the river flows. Now that means you can apply sort of squeezy daily HOFs, hands-off flow conditions, to realize reductions in abstraction. And you can look at the deficit, which is the difference between what the flow is and what you would like it to be on a sort of daily basis. And this is what that looks like in 1991 and 1992. So the Itchen's in blue and the test's in purple. And you realize that you have to get those extra water during those limited periods for about half of the time from somewhere else. And effectively that means that your patterns of abstraction have to change from being, at the moment, relatively just chugs away, producing the water locally for local people. That has to change to a pattern of abstraction which is very much more squeezed seasonally. And that's a real challenge to get that water from, perhaps the northwest of England via a reservoir in Abingdon or somewhere else. It's a big challenge to do. Targets themselves are very similar to the ASB3 targets, but that on-the-day operational responsiveness is a real step change in the sort of operational flexibility. And it means you need a lot of replacement water. It's relatively untried, costly, and carbon heavy, and there's gazillions of pounds involved. So lots of millions for the test, lots of millions for the Itchen. and the operational costs of having to supply the water from effluent recycling are also much greater, and the environmental benefits remain uncertain. And I think there's also something to be said about the fact that I think protected areas do actually need management to protect them. So without that groundwater augmentation scheme, there is a risk that you're hanging the River Itchen out to dry naturally in the face of climate change. My last example is at the bottom of the Hampshire Avon particularly, which is the next river along, also a protected river, and the River Stour here. And the bottom of the Avon, most of the Avon, according to the Chalk Stream First sort of mantra, is pretty close to natural, or at least is within sort of flow targets. So not too much problems until you get to the last very short reach, just over 1 kilometre at the bottom of the Avon, where you get an impacted reach. And these two gauging stations at Nat Mill and Throop, we have on these two pictures here. So you can see, comparing these two rivers, generally the Avon has much more resilient base flows than the Stour. So the Stour is a smaller river with less resilient base flows, but the Avon has some degree of protection, and the notion that you have to meet these targets, even though it's only 1 kilometre, that deficit is 70 megalitres a day, which is around about the entire supply to Bournemouth. So if you want to fix that, what you've got to do is effectively reduce the low flow abstraction. The only place to get the water locally is to increase the low flow abstraction in what is currently a dicky, a river. And so you can only do that with extra support. So we have to go from this situation at the moment where you've got this patterns of abstraction from the main river abstractions, base flow supported, to one where you're reducing here and increasing here. And you have to do that firstly in the water resources management plan. There's the inevitable need to reduce leakage in per capita demand, by 23%, which is a massive ask. There's things that have to be done through smarter conjunctive use. There's current plans to try and to relocate 30 megalitres a day of sewage treatment works discharged from Poole into the top of the Stour, and that seems to be a no-brainer, a low-hanging fruit that's worth doing anyway. But then you go into the realm of the untested. You probably need an aquifer storage and recovery scheme, and you probably end up needing another 30 megalitres a day to come from some new reservoir or reservoirs on the top of the catchment. And after you've done all of that in 25 years' time and spent maybe 300 million quid or something, another 300 million quid, you've turned everything green. Hurrah. But there's actually very little evidence of actual ecological impact on this lower reach. We've looked at the inverts upstream and downstream at this point. There's almost no difference at all. In fact, there isn't any difference. What's often said is fish. What about fish? Well, we've looked at the fish. And so this is evidence, if you like, from 2020, where how much fish in black go up the River Avon compared to the flow in the River Avon and the temperature in the River Avon. The notion that you need more flow for more fish is blown out of the water by this data here. There's certainly the evidence here of some response to spate flows. But generally, if you look at the 2020 data, which is here in black, you find this astonishing conclusion that, you had almost twice as many fish going up the Hampshire Avon in 2020 compared to all of the previous years. And these were years when the abstraction pressure hasn't really changed at all and the water quality is very similar. So you realize then that, fish depend on a lot of things, and probably something to do with the COVID lockdown, whatever was going on out at sea. So I think, again, you have to ask the question, so is the legal requirement to meet this SSSI Sac River CSMG flow target in a very short reach at the bottom of the Hampshire Avon with no clear benefit to the ecology, is that worth 300 million quid to fix? It's also worth bearing in mind that Natural England at the same time, and I think quite reasonably, want to take more water out of the same channel that supports the surface water abstraction and spread it across the floodplain for more effective wetland habitat creation. So there's a bit of kind of mixed thinking there, I think. Thinking towards the future, and I'm going to have to speed up a bit now, we know flows are going down. We look at our modelling, most of our modelling's got trends in our actual evaporation related to the warmer winters. The UK SIP 18 data shows, again, reducing flows. This is for the Dorset Stour at Throop. And looking across where I live, down here in North Cornwall, You know, you look at the picture for low flows over the next 30, 40 years and on, and it's pretty bleak. You know, some fairly significant reductions in low flows expected. Less so where there's some groundwater involved, but still pretty steep. And there isn't, again, as much sort of benefit at the high flows as there had been previously predicted. So we're not necessarily expecting masses more recharge in the winter because of the warmer winters that we've been obviously experiencing. We should and could and can use the actual regional models to get better predictions of climate. And we should and can use the models to look at more severe droughts. So this is an example from the test and the Itchen, where effectively compared to the 1976 drought, you know, the sort of things that water companies are having to plan for, 1 in 500, 1 in 200, etc., much lower flows again. And I think we do need to be clear with stakeholders as to what, you know, where that's taking us and where will supplies come from under those conditions. Where is the storage if we can't pump groundwater anymore? And also we need to be honest, I think, about nature-based solutions, which is often brought up at this point. You know, with the best will in the world, in a drought situation, no amount of nature-based solutions is going to turn that sort of picture into that sort of picture. So last few slides, because I need to leave a bit of time. Things I think we should do, we need to make our models fit. So, you know, I said that John Lawson's CSF models fit very well. We maybe don't believe the concepts, but, you know, here's an example of one local to where he's put these pictures. We've got a regional model, which maybe we think's got all the concepts in, but it doesn't fit very well. So we have to fix that first. You know, the models have to locally fit, and that means that can be expensive to get that local refinement so it fits locally well everywhere. But I think it's important for credibility to do that. We have to engage in this model wising up process with the tools that the agency uses for their kind of policy decision making. We certainly have to upload the data from the models into these sort of national packages where they can be made use of for hydroecological flow screening, like this sort of thing. I think we need to do more of that, and we need to use the models to give stakeholders a really good understanding of what's going to happen to flows in their catchment anyway. And finally, I think we do have to sort of not just model and muddle. We do actually have to start delivering stuff again in a more holistic way. And nature-based solutions and wetlands and all of that are absolutely great for that. And we should just get on with them now, really. I think we should. So I think we have a choice. You know, either we just do the muddling, like I've sort of been describing, report the results, don't mention the elephant, and wait until Ofwat says no, you know, which could be a bit disappointing. I might be wrong, of course. Maybe they won't say no. Or we release the elephant. I think we talk more in between this draft and final plans about actual ecological benefits versus cost. We do need all of the rapid stuff. We need to improve our climate resilience, but not replace what we've got already. And I think we need to get real. There's a number of things that I'm calling kind of green-wished myths. So, you know, my first one is mammoth groundwater abstractions are a good thing. I don't think that's true. Groundwater augmentation is a sticking plaster bad thing. Sometimes, yes, but not always. It'll be all okay because we'll all use loads less water. I don't think we will unless the government bites the bullet and introduces universal metering, which is politically unlikely. Again, water companies will vastly reduce leakage. You know, we know a lot of the leakages at household connections, and that's you can only go so far. Nature-based solutions will actually, as well as being great for the environment, they will raise drought flows for more abstraction. I think that's extremely unlikely. I think they're much more likely to evaporate more water, and climate change is likely to lower flows anyway. And protected areas need to be left natural. I think we have to actually actively manage them to deliver the benefits. So generally make the most of our aquifers for people and the environment, and work across organisations to actually deliver stuff if we can now. And really, I think a lot of this is about reclaiming a more holistic meaning of the word sustainable. I've put a magazine article into the SciWem thing in February 2023, which says all of that without any of the pictures. It nearly killed me. But yeah, so that's out there, and that's the end. And there's a whole 5 minutes for talks, which are questions. Sorry, Elias, far too much.
Thank you very much, Rob. Can you please join me in a virtual round of applause for Rob? It was a very nice presentation. Thank you. Very balanced as well. So I'm opening it up to the floor. We have, I think at some point we reached 137 attendance. So can you please put your hand up and or put your comment on the chat, and then we'll pick up on that. I think Michael Kahinde is there on the screen. Go on, Michael.
Much, Rob, for that quite interesting presentation. It all makes sense. And some of us have been agitating for this over a long time, but we seem to be the kind of a lone voice in the wilderness. Because you are so mixed up in this issue of influencing and getting the ears of people, who is going to bear the cat with respect to making people understand that pragmatism in water resources management is the best approach rather than this dogmatic, stiff-necked hold on to just build reservoirs? Is it because engineers are more able to convince people, or is it because we in the groundwater industry are just not to
the right way? So I think, Michael, I think groundwater is inherently mysterious and difficult to explain to people, and we often find ourselves bitterly misunderstood. But I do also think that that there is a real risk of disempowerment with the latest kind of ratcheting up and broadening of the brush. And I think that's very much shared by, I mean, conversations I've had with folk in the Chalk Stream First group, you know, who are all for the idea that we do need to be prioritized and worry about affordability. And it is inherently very difficult, I think, when essentially everybody wants their own river prioritized. You know, and unless we can find some way of breaking out of that and understanding that we only have a limited amount of goodwill and money to spend, I think it's going to be, it's a hard thing, and I'm not quite sure how we'll get out of it, but yeah.
Great, thank you. Alessandro is next.
Yeah, excellent presentation, Rob. Very quickly, I wanted to add another small elephant as well. There hasn't been mentioned. The river morphology, because obviously the water company are doing reduction of structure, but also in parallel we do river restoration. In our patches, only 10, maximum 15% of the chalk stream are natural. The rest of the reaches are mostly detached, completely modified. So even if you assume the water ends up from the aquifer into the river, it doesn't end up in the right point, creates flood and other issues. So, and this is another very large, very expensive, even more expensive than the piping program that you're doing. And is likely to be unaffordable at the scale that we're supposed to do it.
I think it's essential that hopefully what I was saying is that, you know, the need, it's a difficult thing to get this across. I'm not saying river morphology and nature-based solutions are a bad thing. I think they're absolutely essential in terms of making our habitats more resilient for low flows and indeed floods and everything. So I think that's the most important thing to get on with straight away. But the thing that I think isn't true is that doing those things will actually have a significant improvement, or make a significant improvement to the amount of water available for abstraction during droughts. And I think that's difficult because all the water companies are sort of expected to have some sort of deployable output benefit from those things. And I think that's an unreasonable expectation. The work to do that stuff should go on anyway, but it's not going to improve drought yields.
Thank you. Next person had a hand up. Apologies, I may get this wrong. GBHACR, is it?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's Harriet Carlisle. I think it's
Hi,
my
Harriet.
computer name. Yeah, I thought it was an excellent presentation and you raised some very good points. And I think Alessandro mentioned the other elephant that I was going to bring up, which is groundwater flooding, and the fact that it's all very well trying to get back to a naturalized state, but now we've gone and built on half the places that we really shouldn't have done. I'm thinking particularly the city of Hull here is a good example. And, you know, actually you can't go back to a natural environment anymore because, you know, it's not just about water supply, it's also about infrastructure and flooding and the like, and urban development. And the second point is, you said, oh, I don't think there's anywhere where there's any more water mining and saline intrusion going on. And actually that's one thing we're looking at the moment also in Hull, where we hope modern saline intrusion isn't occurring, but the models suggest it might be. There are quite a lot of questions about whether the regional groundwater model is adequately representing the hydrogeology as it stands. I mean, the BGS are doing a lot of very excellent work at the moment, which is proving that the geology as understood isn't quite as it seems. We've discovered there's quite a few catchments where there are perceived low flow issues due to abstraction, where in fact there's absolutely zero monitoring whatsoever, so there's no proof either way. But there's quite a lot of interesting things that we're looking at there that either might prove more elephants in the rooms or you know, might prove to be nothing at all. It's quite interesting how unblack and white it is and how grey even now, and how many years is it going to take before we can be confident of what the model is telling us, really, in terms of then having to drive a solution. So it was more.
No, that's very true, Harriet. And across the water in Grimsby, it's exactly the same story. So it's worth joining that up. You know, Grimsby is the point I keep pointing to, Anglian Water to go and get more water during the winter period, because they could actually, by pumping, make a material difference to groundwater flooding. You know, we know in a way that will avoid, you know, saline intrusion of the past. So it's all a balancing act.
Yeah,
you're right.
It was a very good talk actually at the Einarson lecture a couple of weeks ago on that. And what was the interesting takeaway to me was how different in Grimsby it is, and at least there's a lot more confidence in what the models are telling you. I think we've got almost no confidence, especially close to an estuary on the northern side of the Humber estuary, whereas the southern side it seems to be a little bit clearer about what's going on around Grimsby. But yeah, it's really interesting, and I just wonder, I know that the Streetleys did an excellent talk at the last Sandstone conference as well, which was really interesting about bringing in the ecological evidence with the flow evidence. But it had taken a number of AMP periods. It had taken quite a long time to be able to get to the point where all of those three elements, the ecology, the flows, the groundwater, and the modelling, or the four elements, could all be drawn together with some confidence. And I just wonder how long it's going to take in other parts of the country to get to that level of confidence, really.
Yes, and it's still not being accepted, Harriet.
No,
you know, so actually,
I was impressed by that. I thought, wow.
The river flow objectives have still not been changed in response to that evidence.
Yeah,
so, you know, just moving away from the defaults is a nightmare.
Yeah, and if you make kind of very big and expensive decisions now or in the near future, then are they the right decisions? You know,
exactly.
I don't know. Will we ever know? Don't know. Anyway, enough from me.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to go to the chat before I go to Angelo. Tim Bartlett said, are natural conditions, in inverted commas, in the context of the UK an oxymoron?
Yeah, they are kind of. I mean, where this was rammed home to me most obviously, I mean, obviously drainage is a big issue. In the work on the test and the itching for Natural England, the Environment Agency, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not common standards monitoring guidelines should actually be applied to each channel individually of the multiple channel, you know, where one of the channels is called the Itchen navigation because it was a canal, you know, so yes, it is really a bit of an oxymoron. You know, effectively what it means is flows without abstraction or discharges. You know, that's what it's taken to understand because it's a tool for regulating abstraction. But yes, good question. And indeed, the other interesting thing, I mean, I found in the work on the wetlands, it was interesting that some of the folks who I worked with at Redgrave were making the point that, that actually the outcomes in those wetlands was critically dependent on the management of the vegetation on them, the grazing, the extent to which you're chopping down the trees that will otherwise ingress, etc. And that those things needed to be sort of, given more kind of prominence in the outcome, that you're effectively gardening for something that you want to deliver, really.
Mm-hmm. That's great, thank you. So I'm going to go to Angelo next.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Rob. Long time no
Angelo
speak.
Papuano, hello.
How you doing? Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's a while since I've worked on any of this stuff, but I haven't looked at who's on the attendance list. But are people? Presumably, this is not the first time you've given this cage a shake. Are people in the Environment Agency, Natural England, listening to your words, and maybe we've pulled this too far in some respects? What's your opinion on things? No,
I don't think so. And interestingly, I don't think the people in the water companies are either at the moment. I mean, everybody is, particularly in the water companies, are getting it in the neck for all the things that they get it in the neck for, and so nobody's really prepared to stick their head above the parapet and say these things. I think also, to a certain extent, everybody has regionally thought up their own set of eye-wateringly massive numbers, and we haven't yet got to what the total national, even more eye-wateringly massive number is. And at that point, presumably, it gets under Ofwat's nose and something happens. But so I think we have rather unwisely generated a sort of a loop of expectation that will end up in disappointment.
I'm sure you're right that with regard to the wetlands, some management, if you like, careful gardening is appropriate. Not so sure quite how that approach can be applied with regard to riverine habitats, but I think you're right that that there is a more pragmatic solution to be had. Yeah, and very interesting talk. Thanks, Rob. Cheers.
Thank you. There's a couple of messages in the chat, but before I go to them, I'll go to John Lawson next.
Thank you very much. A fantastic talk, Rob. Absolutely brilliant. My question to you is, you've made this talk and you presented a really powerful argument that these abstraction reductions are just far, far, far too much, and the cost will be billions, which incidentally will detract from billions which are needed to deal with the sewer overflow problem. But my question to you is, you've made this presentation to 130 hydrogeologists. How are you going to get this message to the decision makers in Ofwat and the Environment Agency?
Yeah, so hopefully it's not 130 hydrogeologists, because I forwarded it to all the people in the water companies as well and the Environment Agency. So I should imagine there's a few of them. And I very much, although Helen asked me from the Geological Society if I wanted to do a paper on this, I said no, because I've effectively done this article, which will be in the SciWem journal on February next year. So, and that's a much more sort of aimed at a layperson sort of account over 2 or 3 pages of the same thing. So hopefully that way, but also I'm hoping that, I mean, I don't know, I'm old and grumpy, and as somebody said at the beginning, I don't really mind saying stuff now, but hopefully other people will be asking the questions in the projects that they're working on, because I think people just need to start asking the questions in a bit more louder way. It's also been great working with you, John, to be honest. It's been really interesting. And, I started from a position of thinking that chalk stream first stuff was bonkers. And actually, I can see entirely where you're coming from. I don't believe in all of it, but I think there's, something to be said for it. But I do think our biggest problem is prioritization. I don't know how we're going to decide, where it is worth spending the money we want to spend on it. So,
thank you. I think Michael, is that the legacy hand or is that the new hand?
It's a new hand. And it's Rob, my question would be, is there anyone that is looking at the fact that when we pursue this total turnaround or walking away from groundwater abstractions, wherever we think they are, the fact that there is going to be a consequence in some places, not in every place, but in some places, and the consequence will be the risk of groundwater emergence and the attendant flooding risk, increase in flooding risk. Is there anyone looking at that? And is there any costing, economic costing of the measures that will be needed to be put in place in order to address that risk of flooding or the additional risk of groundwater flooding in all
Yeah, there is some work going on, Michael. So I'm aware that obviously a lot of the flooding things tend to fall with the local councils. There are a number of streams of research work into groundwater flooding at the moment being funded by DEFRA. So Lincolnshire councils, for example, have just got a chunk of money for the next 2 or 3 years to put in better monitoring, to look at particularly that issue around Grimsby and to try and understand, exactly what you're talking about, really. So some people are thinking about it, certainly.
If we go ahead with the reductions that are planned, okay, and you say monitoring, we're not working in parallel to put in measures already, costs and so on, to put in infrastructure that would carry away that excess water that is likely to come out. Nobody seems to be looking at that at all. We're just marching on towards the environmental destination without taking account of the downside of what we're planning to do. And I think that is a kind of omission that we could not allow ourselves to do.
I mean, certainly routinely, I think if groundwater modelers are asked to, consider what the impacts of abstraction reductions are, then we should be routinely looking at the unsaturated depths that result from the reductions, and taking into account all the bits that we don't believe about what the model's doing under those conditions. But nonetheless, it should be a routine component of assessing the sustainability, let's use that word, of these options.
Thank you very much. There's a couple of very nice comments on the chat. I'm not going to read all of them. I'm just going to go to the questions. But please put your hand up if you think that I skipped something that you would like to say. I think Victoria Price asked, is it possible to look at WRMPs and see what the cost of the planned reduction in groundwater abstraction is in terms of costs for reservoir / desal / effluent reuse construction, etc.?
Yeah, good idea, Victoria. I don't know who does that in the whole sort of process of Environment Agency and Ofwat review of water resource management plans. I mean, at some point, probably Elias will know better than me. Does somebody add up all the numbers nationally and sort of come to a conclusion on these things? It should be done, but I don't know who does it.
Yes, it should be done, I guess, at Ofwat scale. But I think, yeah, so question if your presentation can be shared by Steve Barrow.
Yeah, I don't know what happens to it. Does it go? The last time I did one of these, it ended up on YouTube or something. I don't know what happens with it. But...
Well, I guess this session is recorded, so we can share the recording afterwards. I guess the question is about the actual slides.
Yeah, it's fine. Just tell me where you want to put them. Anybody's happy to have them.
Okay.
Most of my slides, though, people know from bitter experience, unless you see what I was wittering on about, it's quite hard to know what on earth they were actually about. So
yeah, that's fine. And there's another question from Victoria Price. How do we communicate with all those different groups who want their individual streams? Oh, hang on, sorry, I lost it. With the individual streams protected when looking at prioritization?
Most difficult, Victoria, I think that is the most difficult question. I would say what we have to do is engage in all catchments with things on the ground, focused on biodiversity stuff that will make a difference. So, you know, I think everybody, because everybody's enthusiastic about their own catchment, we need to have those sort of easy wins, obvious, you know, small wetlands, whatever, floodplain reconnection things going on everywhere, so that everybody feels loved, and so that, in fact, you know, something is being done. I think it's then, there then needs to be some sort of nationally sort of balanced reconciliation of where the huge money on the kind of, you know, the abstraction reductions and replacement sources need belongs. So I think we should do that as a no-brainer anyway. And I think personally, I think the water companies should be involved in that, because I think it's good for them to be involved in that, even though I don't honestly think it will improve their deployable output, but I think it's a good thing to do.
Thank you very much, Rob. I think that's that with the questions on the chat. If you feel that I missed something that you would like to just pose the question yourself, please put your hand up. Angelo, I guess that's a legacy hand, yeah?
Sorry, yeah, I'll try and find out how to put my hand down. Sorry, guys. Yep.
No problem.
There's an interesting comment from John Heathcote as well, about trees. You know, I mean, that's another, well, I don't know if it's a myth or not, but, you know, trees, great thing, but less water, probably. They will evaporate more water, I suspect.
Yeah, would you like to elaborate on that, John, or?
Yeah, my point was that, you know, 1,000 years ago, when things were more natural than they are now, forest cover was extensive and there was presumably less water.
Yeah.
So, you know, we can't go back to natural unless we plant all the trees, dismantle all the cities. It's just not going to happen, which comes back to the idea of natural England being an oxymoron. We're never going to be there again.
Yeah, I have a similar question around the how natural things are and about the land use change over time. I guess with the urbanization of the catchments, the way recharge gets into the aquifer has changed slowly through time. How can that be better taken into account in the regional groundwater models?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, certainly the work, you know, the work that's been done on the sandstone models up in the north, particularly, which I think are probably the areas where they've been subject to the most urbanization directly, you know, has had to, in some cases, go back to the Victorian area and sort of try and track the extent of increased recharge and sewage spreading and various changes in the response of the catchment. So, you know, where it matters, that has had to be a feature of things. I think for a lot of the things that we want to use the models for, though, it's okay to be, because they're mostly used about decisions about where we go from now. So, you know, you can consider things in scenario ways, which I think is what's going to happen a lot with the nature-based solutions. You know, but managing aquifer recharge is another thing I suspect to come on the agenda fairly soon as a big bandwagon-y thing. I think it's really difficult to put more water into aquifers, but I think it will be a topic of hot debate.
Thank you. Adam Taylor?
Hi, yeah, sorry. Just coming back to the question about trees. I mean, is part of the reason why everything's getting squeezed so much is because everything's being compared to naturalized scenarios that we're simulating in these regional models? I mean, would it make sense to cover all of those naturalized simulations in woodland? Would that solve the problem completely? Or is that too simplistic?
Good question. It would certainly wipe out a lot of the water anyway.
Yeah.
Yes, that would lower your target flows considerably.
Exactly, yeah.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. if that's okay, we'll close it here. I think, yes, we said we can share a copy of the slides, and the recording will be available at some point. Just to let everyone know, I think Christopher Barry put it in the chat. The next webinar is planned for the 12th of January at 4 o'clock again. Alistair Black from Groundwater Science on why river flow recovery is less than abstraction cessation, examples from ephemeral rivers.
Very, very, very much like what I've been saying. Excellent. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Thank you all.
See you, folks. Bye.
See you all at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Rob. Great talk.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, great stuff.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.